Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Welcome to this special program about young voters, millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, and their even younger counterparts, members of the so-called Generation Z. Taken together, these groups now surpass baby boomers as America's single largest group of eligible voters. But will they actually show up at the polls in November? Early indications of energy and enthusiasm signal that they may. Past voting patterns suggest they won't. The point is, youthful voters have the power to decide elections should they choose to use it, and issues of concern to them are already having an impact. In the coming hour, we will show you how a new generation of younger candidates, many women and people of color, and a host of new groups that support them threaten the establishments of both major parties. We'll talk with Vaughn, co-founder and CEO of Flippable, created, as the name suggests, to flip state legislatures from red to blue. Nathan Rubin, founder of Millennial Politics, which showcases candidates who support the progressive values that are important to many young voters. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's running against Democratic incumbent Joseph Crowley in New York's 14th Congressional District. And Renaldo Pearson, the newly chosen mission director of the grassroots social movement known as Democracy Spring. This joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network is coming to you from El Barrio Firehouse Studio in East Harlem, New York. Before hearing from our guests, let's take a quick look at the growing size of the youth vote and its political potential. In the past, it was easier to ignore young people and the issues important to them, since they weren't the largest block of voters and many never made it to the polls, while older voters regularly turned out in large numbers on Election Day. Only half of all eligible young people actually voted in the last election. Will those numbers go up this time around? Donald Trump's surprising election victory in 2016
President of the United States
met immediate resistance from dismayed citizens, especially women, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ people, and all who felt marginalized and threatened by the new president's divisive rhetoric.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Trump's win soon led to the creation of a host of organizations: Flippable, Run for Something, The Arena, and many others, all dedicated to reversing Republican control of government by recruiting and assisting a new cohort of Democratic candidates.
I'm Nadia Okamoto, and I'm running for Cambridge City Council.
Many are people of color, women and young people who never stood for office before. People like Suraj Patel, running in a New York primary against a more mainstream Democrat, incumbent Carolyn Maloney, in New York's 12th Congressional District.
People are marching, people are resisting, students are walking out and protesting about guns. We're tired of sitting on the sidelines and waiting our turn, and it's time for a new generation of people to take leadership.
The emphasis on youth is no accident. In the past, it was easier to overlook younger voters as a political force, since they weren't the largest bloc and many never made it to the polls. But millennial and younger people now make up America's largest group of eligible voters, surpassing baby boomers for the first time. Still, questions remain about their impact. Will they show up on Election Day?
I've always voted at the major elections, but local elections, which I realize now.
Participation across the board is necessary, and that means you have to show up for the protest, you have to show up to the phone bank, and on Election Day, you have to cast your vote at the ballot box.
Will youth comprise the largest bloc of actual voters in the coming midterms? Early indications of energy and enthusiasm seem to suggest they will.
We are constantly told that we are the future.
California teens, for example, seem poised to rock the vote when they turn 18. 100,000 16 and 17-year-olds have already pre-registered in the Golden State.
For those of us who are 16 or 17,
We can actually pre-register to vote.
In the aftermath of the February school shooting in Parkland, Florida, which left 17 dead, political activism among the young skyrocketed. The media-savvy student survivors of Parkland sparked a national movement demanding gun safety legislation.
96 people die every day from guns in our country, yet most representatives have no public stance on guns. And to that, we say no more.
Other issues of concern to the young include economic policies that steal from their future. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich.
According to Pew Research, millennials are the first generation in the modern era to have a higher level of student debt, poverty, and unemployment, and lower levels of wealth and personal income than any other generation at the same stage of life.
Nathan Rubin is the founder of Millennial Politics, dedicated to showcasing the next generation of political activists, leaders, and organizations.
When you think about climate change, it's real, it's happening, we need to do something about it. When you think about criminal justice reform, the drug war failed. We need to end mass incarceration and move on and find ways to better our system. When you look at LGBTQ civil rights, those are civil rights. We need to protect them. We need to advance them. When you look at women's reproductive rights, those things need protection.
It turns out that there are a lot of young people who really have a very different vision for where this country should go than the establishment does, right, who are prepared to think big.
The millennials and Gen Z is coming for every type of political office there is. We're not going to take it, as long as we can vote, as long as we're going to have a voice, we're going to be out in the streets.
But history shows younger voters often sit out elections, particularly midterms, while Trump's base of older and whiter supporters regularly turn out in large numbers. It is one thing to be eligible to vote, and another entirely to actually cast a ballot.
It's up to you, the millennials, to fix a system we boomers broke.
Only about half of all eligible young voters actually voted in 2016, and younger people traditionally drop out at higher rates in non-presidential elections like this year's. So the growing size of the youth vote may be offset by lower participation. Which factor will win out in November?
Well, I am cautiously optimistic. In the 2016 election, millennials turned out about 45%. If you can just get that up to 55% voter turnout, that's a lot of seats that are flipped right there.
Rubin is right. A recent poll shows millennials are more eager to vote than in previous midterms, and a large majority now favor Democrats over Republicans. That's why GOP lawmakers are trying to make it more difficult for young people to vote by curbing opportunities for registration and early voting, reducing polling places, and requiring photo IDs with a current address. Countering those efforts to restrict access to the polls and encouraging young Americans to show up and vote will be crucial to creating change. All right, so I'd like to begin with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Alexandria, you are one of those candidates we're talking about on this program. Tell us a little bit about what went in to your decision to run.
Yeah, I come from a very unique district. Our district is New York 14. It's half in the Bronx and half in Queens. And we actually haven't had a primary election in New York 14 in 14 years. And, I come from a background of education, of organizing. I was really kind of deep in some activist movements. And when I kind of picked my head up, I realized we have a lot of work that we need to do at home.
Yeah, now you were the director of Bronx for Bernie, I think, 2016, something like that.
I was not the director, but I definitely organized on that campaign, yes, in the South Bronx, and knocking on those doors and really knocking on doors that hadn't been knocked on in a very long time was a key part of my decision.
How so?
Well, I think when you start kind of knocking on your neighbor's door and talking to them about issues of health care, on education, when I started having these conversations, I realized that our community, particularly communities of color, particularly young communities, communities with low voter turnout, kind of in turn have been neglected by the Democratic Party as well. They say, oh, well, they don't vote, so we don't have to pay attention. And I think that it creates a chicken and egg situation that it requires someone to fix it, to kind of go in and break that cycle. And I just feel like we could do better in our elected representation. And
now, I'm sure you've heard the whole argument that Crowley is an important up-and-comer in
yes.
or long-timer in the Democratic Party. He could be the next speaker,
Right.
replacing Nancy Pelosi. Do you really want to primary somebody like that? And what do you say?
Well, primaries are always inconvenient for those in power, aren't they? You know, when Democrats are in the majority, it's let's not rock the boat. When Democrats are in the minority, it's we've got Republicans to boot out. But at the end of the day, the advancing causes of social, economic, and racial justice in many aspects have been abandoned by certain members of the party. And it's up to us as young people, as activists, as organizers, to really hold the fort and bring the Democratic Party back to the championing of working class Americans.
All right, so we're going to come back to some of the issues in a minute, but I'd love to hear from you all. How typical is Alexandria? For one thing, this fact of having played a role in an election campaign, in this case for Bernie, but having done that door knocking, how influential is that in people's decision? Catherine?
I mean, I think she's very typical, but also very unique.
Well, of course.
As an up-and-coming candidate. So I got my experience from working on the Hillary campaign. I hadn't really been involved in politics before. I always wanted to make a difference. I'd worked in a number of nonprofit organizations, but hadn't seen an opportunity in politics. And I think that's because it was seen, I saw it as an old boys club. I wasn't spitting out all of the facts about everything in government like Josh Lyman on the West Wing. And those were the people who I had seen going to school with me, heading up the Democrats Club and all of that stuff. So I think for me, having that experience was incredibly influential in my decision to start an organization. And so many of our candidates have also had experiences knocking on doors, actually talking to voters, telling them really important information about where and how to vote, because Republicans make that really hard. And kind of having that experience of sharing democracy with someone else, and it's inspired them to run, especially in a time when especially women and people of color feel so threatened by our government.
Renaldo, have you done your share of door knocking?
Sure. My share has been more so along of movement building, activism. But, you know, as I was just sharing with a few of my peers here, politics and activism are kind of, you know, inextricable. As a mentor once told me, if you're not sitting at the table, you're certainly on the menu.
That's right.
So now more so than ever before, I think that kind of appetite that Dr. Dorothy Height, who was the godmother of the civil rights movement, right before she passed, she said what was missing from our generation is this righteous indignation that her generation had. I think she'd be a little more proud if she were alive today. And I think it's because more and more we're coming out and we're saying, this is not the country we deserve better.
Yeah. So Alexandria, when you're running, what are the things that you lift up, that you stand for, that maybe your opponents don't?
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things that has kind of distinguished our campaign is that we're unafraid to really push the line in our district, but also nationally. So I was one of the first candidates in the country to come out in favor of the abolishment of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I come out in favor of a federal jobs guarantee, improved and expanded Medicare for all, and also the decriminalization of marijuana and reducing our prisons by about 50% in 15 years. And these are big, bold ideas, and a lot of people would think that this is radical. But really what we're finding is that bold, tangible ideas is what galvanizes an electorate, especially a young electorate that is looking at its leadership and saying, what do you got? You know, what does better mean? And when we say this is what we're about, and we can talk about the details, but these are our values, we can advance that line. And I think we can actually have a campaign worth turning out for.
How are you looking at this picture, Nathan, in terms of candidates around the country? Are there other people, in addition to Alexandria, that you're particularly excited about?
Definitely, and I think, you know, just to echo what she was saying, we heard earlier in that pre-roll clip that millennials are perhaps disengaged but getting more engaged, but they're also in a much worse financial position than previous generations. And they've seen the leadership that have been at the helm of these political parties, and those aren't the people that are going to get us out of these problems. So policies like what she just espoused, that's really going to galvanize, like she said, that young base and help us get to the polls, because the people who gave us the problems that we have aren't going to be the ones that get us out of this.
Like Robert Reich said, we broke it, you fix it.
Exactly.
Then let's just dig down into that just a little bit for people that for whom perhaps the penny hasn't dropped about the condition of life for millennials and Gen Zers. I mean, this is a serious situation of indebtedness to schools, to auto companies, to credit card companies, few assets. Some people might say, well, that doesn't leave you a whole lot of time to get involved in politics. You're too busy trying to earn a living.
Well, I think exactly to your point, we see where Folks are overqualified, underpaid, they're in debt. The government and private student loan companies have been using students as profit centers, and the rate of tuition increase has far exceeded the rate of wages increase. So you will get an education worth $100,000, $150,000, and come out and only be able to get a job that pays $40,000 a year or $45,000 a year. When you live in a city like New York, for example, or any other large metropolitan area, the cost of living is just far too high for that salary that you're going to be earning right out of school.
And the Bronx is one of the parts of this country that sees those problems really large. Do you find a challenge for your supporters to come out and volunteer?
Well, it is certainly a challenge, and this is where spaces are. Whenever you basically have political spaces, sometimes you do have those aspects of privilege that come in. It's the people who can take that time off that do. But what we also do is that we innovate in our organizing, and the Bronx is a very familial place. Jackson Heights, Corona, and Queens is a very familial place. So we'll say, organize at your dinner table, get your family registered. And so having that kind of adapting our organizing to the communities that we're in is profoundly important. And people will turn out when we advance the line on policies like, for example, our campaign is advancing investigation into federal student loan forgiveness, and having that program really alleviate the burdens of an entire generation and also revitalize our economy overall.
And to what extent does the age of the candidate matter? Are you seeing also older candidates adjust their set of promises, their agenda, their plans? Renaldo.
You know, I was thinking about that when my friend here talked about the older politicians not being capable of representing the policies that we actually care about the most. But I would have a caveat there. They could if we push them. Yeah. Right? FDR in this famous example where he had A. Philip Randolph at the table, and A. Philip Randolph is going down this list of grievances from the African American community, and he goes through it, and then he finally finishes, and FDR says, you know, something along the lines of, "That's great, now make me do it." That's right. Right? So FDR showed that he could do it. LBJ started as a Dixiecrat out of the South, and ended up being the fiercest champion and partner of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and then of course there's Bernie. You know,
at the state level also, let's think about the recent primary victory for Stacey Abrams in Georgia.
Exactly.
First black woman gubernatorial candidate on the Democratic Party ticket, or any major party ticket. She relied on young voters, or she put her trust in them. Is that what's happening at the state level more broadly?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there are a number of revolutions happening at the state level. The first just being that Democrats are paying attention to the state level for the first time in a while. We lost over 1,000 seats during Obama's presidency at the state and local level. And it meant that we lost control and majority control of chambers and states across the country. Republicans in power used their majorities to roll back voting rights, to gerrymander districts, to basically entrench their control. And we've woken up to that, and I think that there are a lot of people who are coming up challenging not only the anti-democratic practices of the GOP majorities in these states, but also so many other policies that I think Democrats have traditionally felt like they needed to toe the line on or be really moderate on. And I think that they're coming forward with a perspective and a view and passion. And we're, you know, when I was thinking about volunteers, some of whom don't have the privilege to spend hours and hours outside, we're knocking on doors. I do think that a passionate candidate will get people to take those extra hours, someone who's already working 2 jobs and, you know, who's paying off student debt, to convince their neighbors and their friends to vote.
I mean, we're going to keep moving forward, but I have to ask you to go back for 2 seconds. How do you explain the sort of lack of attention to the states for these many years under the Obama administration, which was preceded by a similar phenomenon during the Clinton administration, to be clear?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of explanations. One of them is that Citizens United allowed a lot of dark money to be poured into state races, particularly on the Republican side. And the Republican Party is the party of the wealthy, and, you know, they don't depend on a broad grassroots campaign. And so I do think that there were a lot of nefarious tactics that Republicans practiced that kind of let them sneakily take control of states. I also think that Democrats tend to think about reform in terms of broad national civil rights movements that have been, our major accomplishments over the past half century. So, I don't want to pass marriage equality in one state. I want to pass it in every state. And so I think that we've tended to kind of shy away from state politics because perhaps we think that so much more legislation should be federal. We're seeing that states actually do have the power to pass more progressive policies when we are able to gain majorities in them. And so we're seeing the positive potential of states as well right now as we try to kind of fight back and claw ourselves back from the situation that we're in.
Yeah, states' rights have had a very negative connotation, of course, with fights over civil rights law, but it does seem like people are looking at local power and making a difference at the local level, even in the municipal level. Renaldo, want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I would piggyback on that by saying that it's actually the states that, for instance, right now we have less voting rights than we did 50 years ago when the Voting Rights Act was passed. And that's because last year alone, 99 bills were passed in states to suppress the right of votes. So you're absolutely right that in terms of thinking of change, we've got to think locally and think globally, but act locally. Think globally.
And in terms of going back to this money question for a minute, for young candidates, you just talked about money in politics. How do young candidates like Alexandria, maybe we'll ask you too, how do they get the resources to run in some of these races, even the smallest of which sometimes now are terribly expensive?
Well, I think going back to everything that's been said here, I mean, Bernie really showed a path where you can rely on a grassroots bed of support and those small dollar donations, and you can run a real campaign. And I think with all of the dark money that's been floating around, there's a real emphasis for candidates to push away PAC money, push away corporate money, and really focus on, I'm running for you, you can help me win this campaign, and that's where my allegiance is going to be. And I think that's really what the future is going to be. Even if Citizens United is not overturned in the near term, we're going to be looking to elect candidates that refuse the special interest money.
Alexandria, is that how you're doing it?
Yeah, it is. I come from a working class background. My mother cleaned homes and drove school buses. And so the idea of kind of having these $1,000 cocktail fundraisers to run for Congress was completely out of the picture. And so I'm the only candidate in this race to completely reject corporate PAC money. And as a result, we've organized over 14,000 contributions to our campaign. Thank you. Averaging $14 a piece. And we've been able to do that by really kind of marshaling the resources of being digital natives as millennials and say, we know how to use these platforms, we know how to navigate them, that's our strategic advantage, and we're going to take it to the ballot box.
Again, typical?
Absolutely. It's something that we've really learned from so many candidates who focus on the number of donors. I mean, even the way that she was talking about that, a lot of people will say we've raised X million dollars rather than we have 14,000 people who are supporting the campaign. And that's one way of kind of shifting the narrative a little bit to the grassroots base of support that you have rather than the number of $1 million check writers that you have.
So we're going to talk in a minute about what role some of these movement groups play. But to kick that off, who's helping you?
I've got a brand new Congress, Justice Democrats. We have also been endorsed by local chapters of the Movement for Black Lives, Muslims for Progress, and also Democratic Socialists of America. So those are our boots on the ground, but also digitally we've got, even People for Bernie as well has endorsed our campaign.
And have you gone out of your way to get that support? Is that going to be critical to you?
Yeah, it absolutely is. The only thing that matters is the work that gets done on the ground when it comes to grassroots campaigns. And so every single active endorsement. There are some groups that have paper endorsements. Well, they will put their logo on for you. But the endorsements that matter for us are few, and they're the ones that put those boots on the ground.
So even though you're the digital natives, it still is important that actual door knocking and talking to people.
Oh, I would 100% agree. I think, candidate to voter contact is the way to win elections. And you can spread your message online far and wide, but if you're not communicating directly to your constituents, they don't have as strong of a reason to turn out for you.
All right, well, when we come back, we're going to pick up on this exact topic and talk about the role that social movements play in this party political arena. Stay tuned, more to come. So welcome back. I want to go to Renaldo Pearson next. First, explain your shirt. Tell us a little bit about what you're wearing there.
So yeah, this is a shirt for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And it's a 6-week campaign that pretty much is It revives the dream that died with its revolutionary dreamer 50 years ago, Dr. King. His dying dream was this Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
Folks would come to D.C. and have an Occupy before Occupy, right? An encampment there on the National Mall highlighting poverty. So different from that time, it's national. It's not just in D.C., it's there too, but it's in over 30 states across the country, and it highlights this issue of poverty. 1 in 2 Americans today are in poverty or low income, according to the Supplemental Poverty Measure. 140 million Americans. And what does that mean today? So that's what this is about. We're using nonviolent direct action. Folks are risking arrest over these 40 days, 6 weeks, and we're at the midpoint.
And Democracy Spring is a sponsor of it, is a partner in this project.
Yeah, we're a national partner. Absolutely.
And what has it got to do with the electoral campaigns that we're talking about, or does it?
Poor People's Campaign?
Yeah, do you see it having a role in
this? So, you know, it's talking about the systemic injustices that threaten the soul of our democracy. And you can't have that conversation without talking about voter suppression. And, you know, there's something I call the 7 deadly sins of American democracy: voter suppression, voter erasure, this issue of purging, felon disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, the corrupting influence of big money in politics, vulnerable voting machines and Trojan media, and the Electoral College. These are all things that literally threaten the soul of our democracy. In fact, just a few months ago, The Economist Intelligence Report's Democracy Index said that the United States is no longer a full democracy. Yeah. That we're down now to number 21 on that list because of the erosion of public trust in our institutions. Could that be because of the voter suppression bills? Could that be because of the corrupting influence of big money in politics with those 7 deadly sins?
Do you see it as no longer, as The Economist said, or not yet?
Right now, it's broken. The 2016 November election made that crystal clear. Yeah. Voter suppression alone, as Mother Jones has reported, accounted for the scales being tipped. Yeah. Or if you look at voter erasure, the issue of purging, an estimated 1.1 million folks. This is unprecedented. Purged from the rolls, mostly black and brown.
So this is a great example of how a social movement campaign, literally conducting civil disobedience, is intersecting with an electoral discussion, although it's a non-political and non-partisan campaign. How do you see your role at this table as somebody who's more involved on the civil disobedience front? And what's your role in this election going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here's the thing we've understood. Our theory of change with Democracy Spring is pretty much that no major democratic struggle in American history has been won without that weapon that Dr. King called the sword that heals, nonviolent direct action. I mean, from the American Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, women's suffrage, you name it. Nothing has been won without that tool of nonviolent direct action. So we can't be fools to think that that won't be the case now. This system is broken in terms of our democracy, in terms of us getting our fair share of the economy, worker productivity, and the like. So until we actually put our bodies on the line and get into what John Lewis calls good trouble, we're not going to see the type of change that we want from the folks in power.
So is that an implicit critique of voting, of elections, of campaigns? They're not going to do it, we need to do something else?
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, the Dems are starting to respond. Just last week, they responded with, and Democracy Spring was part of the coalition of 25 organizations that pushed them they announced a few weeks earlier this A Better Deal platform. But now they have a Better Deal for Democracy platform. We have House and Senate leadership, Schumer and Pelosi, and all the other Dems following in suit behind them. They were just on the steps of the Capitol outlining how they're going to revitalize the Voting Rights Act, how they're going to implement campaign finance reform, have independent redistricting commissions to rein in on gerrymandering, and to also introduce new ethics standards. That's huge. It's a huge step in the right direction, and it would not be the case without us mobilizing. We organized the largest act of American civil disobedience this century back in April 2016 by having a march from Philadelphia to D.C. to highlight this very thing. And then we sat in on the Capitol steps, over 1,300 arrested. This is the type of action that needs to push folks to, as FDR said, make me do it.
Yeah, now that goes back to Reverend Barber. I mean, the inspiration is Reverend Barber in North Carolina. That was a state struggle where he brought activists from all sorts of political backgrounds together to protest a Republican-controlled state house. Talk a bit about how state tactics are playing out in this national arena now?
Absolutely. I mean, Reverend Barber has been such a pioneer, and it comes from a tradition of civil disobedience focused on small d democracy, and that's something that we often talk about at Flippable. We're electing capital D Democrats, but really in service of small d democracy in the states, knowing that the states are where these electoral policies are written. So whether it's Wisconsin, which introduced voter ID laws in 2014 that disenfranchised up to 300,000 people in a state that Trump carried by 21,000 votes, or Florida, where anyone who has ever had a felony conviction can't vote ever again in their entire lives, even after serving their sentences. That's 1.6 million people. That's 25% of all African American adults in Florida can't vote. And Trump carried that state by 100,000 votes. So we're talking major electoral outcomes are being decided by states that themselves decide who can vote and can't vote, when and how people can vote. Whether they're purged from the voter rolls. These are huge issues, and I love the fact that so many groups are coming together and making electoral and democracy issues truly the civil rights issues that they are.
So let's talk about the role of these groups. We've mentioned a lot of them: Flippable, Democracy Spring, Millennial Politics. What are you doing concretely, Nathan, in terms of working with candidates like Alexandria or working with voters to change this picture?
Sure. Well, I think going back to what Renaldo said here, one of the 7 deadly sins of democracy was the idea of, I think you said Trojan media, was the phrase that you used. And we exist in an age of digital media, and I think it's really hard for a lot of candidates to get their message out. We have a progressive media platform, a growing national audience, and something that we like to do is invite candidates onto our podcast, our live stream. We write editorial pieces, we boost their social media just by retweeting them and sharing their messages because they align with our values. And what that does is allow them to get exposure that they otherwise may not have gotten, and gives them a national audience that can help to raise their profile on that broader scale. And I think that's really important, just because when you talk about a better deal for democracy, when the president is drowning out all of the news because he is just a vacuum that really sucks it up, it's really hard for Democrats to get their message out and say, we are interested in doing things not because it's going to benefit us directly, but because it's going to benefit American democracy. And that's really important. And one last point that I would like to make here is that we approach it often from a right and a left kind of mentality, but in reality, there is that small d democratic reform that we all want. And as soon as you get to the right and the Republican, they're really borderline autocratic, authoritarian, fascistic. When they purge someone from the voter rolls, when they gerrymander to the point where you could win 60, 70% of the vote and not have even equal representation, that is not right. That is not American democracy. And
you talked about Trojan media, monopoly media. It's part of the problem. Often you turn on the TV channels and you wouldn't want to be part of that political fight that you see playing out there on some of those cable stations. Who helped you? How do you get the word out?
Yeah, well, I think...
Thank you for that.
I mean, I think, what the 4 of us kind of represent overall is we have young people who are making our own media, we're commanding our own civic institutions, we're leading our own social movements, and we're running for office. And so when I think about who helped me at the beginning, it was other young people. Millennial Politics was one of the first media outlets to really highlight our campaign. Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress were the first civically based organizations that said, okay, we're going to give this girl who's campaigning out of her grocery bag a shot. And frankly, the DCCC would never dream of doing that. And so, and moreover, when we defined the platform, especially me coming from a background of activism, it's my belief, especially when you reject corporate money, that social movements are the North Star of our legislation. And I think that we really just got to do it ourselves. And when I think about who helped me, it was really how we all worked together to kind of translate what is happening in our politics to the 2018 midterm elections.
Now, we often talk about sort of youth failure to participate. It often looks to me like kind of amazing that young people manage to participate at all, given the challenges put in front of them. As we're seeing a new generation enter politics, the one we're talking about right now, not just age-wise, but demographically, one of the most diverse generations we've ever seen, I think the most diverse. What needs to change about how we prepare candidates, train them, brief them, back them, communicate about them? What have you got to tell us about how to do things differently?
Well, just piggybacking off of your comment about fundraisers, I think the idea that you need to host these fancy dinners to get people to donate thousands of dollars, that is so anti-democratic to me. And having attended a few of them, it's so uncomfortable as someone who hasn't come from that world. And so one of the things that my organization, among many others, is trying to do is develop a grassroots base of supporters and fund these candidates with grassroots dollars so that they can actually do the work of talking to voters. And I think obviously there are a lot of reasons why our system works the way it does, including Citizens United, and that may not change in the near term. But I do think that our party needs to do a better job of grooming people to speak to voters and listen to voters rather than simply always fundraising and dialing for dollars.
And making a different approach gender-wise, race-wise, making sure immigrants get to vote, to participate. How would you say things need to change?
This is why I fight so hard for campaign finance reform, because, for instance, small dollar matching is important. Right here in New York, Letitia James is an African-American woman. She's the public advocate. She has personally said at a conference I was just at, I also spoke at the Unrig the System Summit in February in New Orleans, that she would not be where she is without public financing systems to get her there. So when you do this type of legislation, it is revolutionary.
Money, I'm hearing. What about other things? I mean, when we train people to be candidates, we're basing our models on all those white guys who are now candidates, who we've seen for generations. What would you change if you were bringing up the next group?
I think we have to change the whole culture of politics. It is elitist, and it is concentrated in the people who have traditionally held power, which generally falls along gender, wealth, and racial lines. And in an America that is diversifying, I think we need to just really kind of bust our political culture open. We need to stop being so concerned about whether our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted. And I think we need to actually stand up for something. And that requires a rhetoric that is different. I think as a reflection of that money in politics, our politics itself, our political culture is very corporate. And so we can't say things that other people would say. And I think that, in terms of our political culture, I think that political candidates would do well to kind of not just use the language, but actually come from the world of activism and social movements, and to say, hey, we need to call a spade a spade. It took so long before a politician actually said Black Lives Matter. It took so long. It was treated as this political dynamite, and it should just be a basic element of fact. And it took so long for people to say things like abortion rights, or some of these things are seen as just political dynamite, but because we haven't talked about them, we have disenfranchised all of those people for which those movements matter. And so I think that in terms of our political culture, we got to be bold, we need to be courageous, we have to be unafraid, like the same people putting their lives on the line on the front lines of activist movements and abroad.
Are women running different in this Me Too moment? Nathan? You thought I was going to go to
Well, I think Alexandria perhaps would be better suited to answer the question. But I would say that what we are seeing is that it certainly seems to be the year of the woman. I saw a fascinating statistic, I think it was in Axios, one of their daily newsletters, about how since the founding of the Senate, there have been over 1,900 male senators, and in that same time, there have only been 52 female senators. And that just absolutely blew my mind. And I think when I look at the folks that are running, perhaps for a variety of reasons, they were reluctant to get into the political space, but perhaps one of the silver linings of the Trump administration is that he has really sparked something amongst the electorate and amongst women in particular, that they said, I need to get into the political arena and I need to make my voice heard. And I think what we're seeing is that they're bringing themselves into their campaigns, and they're already making history. Luba Gretchen Shirley out in Long Island, for example, she encountered a problem and said, I need to pay for childcare. I have these campaign funds. Can I use them to pay for childcare? And this was a historic precedent where the Federal Elections Commission said, yes, you can use your campaign funds to pay for your childcare. And that suddenly, I think, opened a lot of doors for a lot of female candidates that gives them flexibility they otherwise might not have had.
See how good he was on that issue? Anybody else want to weigh in on this? I mean, we are getting the idea that dense concentrations of machismo are a liability when it comes to power.
What would give you that idea?
You want to come in on this?
I mean, thousands, literally thousands of women and people of color have signed up to run for office post-November 2016. And just in the House alone, we have 390 plus women running for office there. I mean, that's unprecedented. You know, so that's a good sign.
All right, Alexandria, back to you on this.
Yeah, well, I think that in terms of women running, I think that we're getting more comfortable running as we are, as Nathan mentioned. I think for a very long time we saw just our culture, but especially how brutal our political culture was to women. You know, I think we saw how Hillary Clinton was really raked over the coals in 2016, regardless of how you feel about our politics. And I think that prevented a lot of women from running. But, you know, when I saw Trump was elected, I said, well, literally anybody can become president now, so I can run too.
All right. Well, thank you all. We'll be back in a moment to look at some next generation candidates you should know more about and some actions that you can take to support them. What is the best path forward for progressives as we approach the crucial midterm elections? I'm Laura Flanders, and you're watching a joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I want to come back to you, Nathan, and talk about some of the things we talked about at the very beginning of this show, which is the condition of life for people in this millennial and Gen Z generation. What are the issues, given the condition that they're in, what are the issues that are particularly turning them out to vote now?
Well, I think it's a number of issues. I think first and foremost, we have to recognize that inequality has been worsening for decades. We've seen productivity increase, we've seen corporate profits reach record highs, and wages are stagnant. And when you think about millennials in particular, we came of age during an endless war in the Middle East, during the worst financial crisis in generations, and millennials are rightfully skeptical of institutions. With that said, we need political leaders with courage to say, I recognize your situation, I'm going to address income inequality, look to raise the minimum wage, look to address the student loan crisis, and really meet millennials where they are and address issues that are important to them. And those are just two of the ones related to their financial situation, but there are a whole host of others, I think, that are more social in nature that are really important to them.
And yet, Catherine, politicians have reason to say, okay, well, we hear that every election, and every election young voters don't turn out, so I'm not going to go off track with my older voters to cater to younger ones who aren't going to show on the day.
You know, I think that we maybe have too pessimistic a view of voters in general. You know, Medicaid expansion was a huge issue for Virginia voters last year, and as of today's taping, it looks like Medicaid expansion is going to pass in Virginia. So many of the voters that some of our candidates talked to last year were covered by employer plans or by other plans, but they wanted everyone in Virginia to have an opportunity for health care. And I think that there are members of the older generation as well who see the predicament that their children and grandchildren are in. And, you know, I don't think that they're going to necessarily vote against our interests simply because a Democrat running is, you know, standing up for millennials for the first time, really. So I do think that the general national mindset is shifting around the situation that young people are in, and also us being the future voters. And you know, if we don't vote this time, we're voting next time, and things are changing.
And the skepticism people have about young voters who are driven more by issues than by candidates, how would you see things shaping up this election? You've got big movements around things like gun control, and you seem to see a lesson coming from the Dreamers around the potential of young people to put legislation on the table, and yet there's still this idea, this skepticism that, well, come November, will it really turn out?
Well, November 2016 taught our generation the biggest lesson. You know, there were some folks who did listen to the skeptics who said, oh, your vote doesn't count. And I've seen those same folks, my friends, say, oh my God, I will never fall for that lie again. And the main refrain I've been using is, well, if your vote didn't count, you wouldn't have billionaires trying to suppress it. So I think folks are going to show up like never before in November and on. We already see my generation running for office. She's not the only one. They're across the nation. For mayor, for county council, for city council, up and down the ballot. So we're going to come out and we're going to be the change that we wish to see in the world.
Who are some of the candidates people should know about? Did you want to add anything to that, Nathan?
I did want to jump in there, and I think people have a memory of the 2016 election, but we have had elections after that election, and we've seen in Virginia, we saw a record number of young people voting. We saw with the Doug Jones race in Alabama, again, a record number of young people turning out. We are mobilizing, March for Our Lives, you referenced. These are demonstrations that are reminiscent of some of the larger social movements we've had in our history. I've said it before, I'm cautiously optimistic that young people are going to turn out in November.
Is it possible that the fact that it's a midterm and actually the candidates are closer to home, more local candidates, than this big national presidential race that depends so much on a candidate that might appeal to you, that could make a difference with turnout?
I think people are seeing people like them running for office for the first time. I think that a lot of millennials maybe were less inclined to vote in midterms before when they couldn't relate to anyone running. And where it seemed like such a dry and inaccessible part of politics. There are so many organizations now doing the work to make this easy to understand, to make these issues really relevant, to connect people digitally and in person with the candidates who are running to represent them. So I think that makes a huge difference.
And if I may, something hasn't been said. We're at a tipping point, really, in terms of the crisis that this nation and this world faces, in terms of climate change, in terms of nuclear proliferation, in terms of the climate change piece. We have scientists saying that we've got to act now, to reverse the tide of climate change and how it's going to affect us this century, right? And then in terms of nuclear proliferation, we've seen atomic scientists update that doomsday clock to the closest to midnight than it's been since the height of the Cold War. That's right. I think about what Dr. King said before he passed. He said, either we will learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. I think that's more prescient today than ever before. And our generation gets it. We're like, look, we're not going to fall for this age-old trick of divide and conquer politics anymore. We see that public interest needs to be translated into public policy, and we're going to do everything we can to make that happen.
The other tipping point question, presumably, also is this effort at voter suppression. How much do you think young voters have to do to compensate for the amount of effort that's going into suppressing their vote this election, Nathan?
I think we have to do a lot, and I think we have to recognize that voter suppression extends beyond just the purging of the voter rolls and beyond gerrymandering to having election day during the week and not having automatic voter registration. David Hogg from March for Our Lives recently tweeted, the government sent him a draft card on his 18th birthday. Why can't they register me to vote on my 18th birthday? These are easy, small d democratic reforms that we could do to encourage participation in our democracy. And I think the first step is turning out in November to elect folks like Alexandria who will be able to implement those small d democratic reforms and make it easier to participate in our democracy.
What about people that, we're going to get to what people can do who are of the age to vote in November, but first, what about people who are not yet of the age? Because that package at the beginning talked about the California pre-registration campaign that's getting 16-year-olds registered in advance. What can people do that maybe aren't going to be able to vote this November? Catherine?
I mean, I think I look at the students from Parkland and I'm so inspired by what they've done. The platform that they have and the attention that they've captivated across the country. So definitely getting involved in social movements is something that they can do. When I was canvassing in Virginia for Elizabeth Guzman, who became a delegate in Virginia's House of Delegates, there was a 16-year-old volunteer who was there signing me in and making sure I was fed with pizza and then going and knocking on doors herself. So she was actively participating in democracy. And then of course there are efforts to pre-register 16-year-olds so that they're ready to vote when they're 18. And I think that really lobbying and rallying for those small d democratic reforms are what teenagers can do.
And in terms of candidates, are there a handful that you want to name so that people can start hearing those names if they have such a challenge getting the word out?
So,
Catherine.
So my organization's focused on state legislatures, and there are 7,000 state legislative seats, 6,000
well, maybe don't
of
list
which
all of them.
How much time do we have? So we have 100 candidates that we're supporting. Just to name a few, we're focused on Texas and Pennsylvania right now because they've had primaries already, but we'll be rolling out more, and you can check them out on our website. There's Maria Collette in Pennsylvania, who was both an attorney and then switched her career to be a nurse and has represented children in need of legal representation and served patients, and she wants universal health care. There is Joanna Katanak in Texas, who's running for the state house, who grew up in the foster care system and really is going to know how to represent all of her constituents because of the experiences that she's had. There's Caleb Frostman, who's running in Wisconsin in a special election that Scott Walker tried to cancel. But he's running because the courts wouldn't let him do it. And he is running as a white man on a platform of extending civil rights and uplifting people of color and ending voter suppression. So there are these amazing candidates that I would definitely suggest checking out.
Alexandria, those people you want to mention?
Yeah. I'm proud to be part of a national coalition of congressional candidates. There are over 55 of us nationwide in 2018 that are rejecting all corporate PAC money, and so as a result, some of these candidates are utterly transformational. You have Chardo Richardson out in Florida, who's a veteran and an ACLU lawyer. You have Amy Villela, who's a working mother who actually tragically lost her daughter due to private health insurer loopholes. And so she's running for Congress to change that. You've got Cori Bush, who was a pastor, a nurse, and she was part of the movement for Black Lives in Ferguson, and now she's running to take that congressional seat and make sure we have criminal justice reform on a federal level. And that is what we can accomplish when we are tightly tied to social movements, reject corporate money, and run like we've never run before.
Now, how do you know when a candidate is rejecting corporate money?
Well, they can either take a pledge. There are organizations that kind of certify it, like Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress. And you can also, journalists can do the work of looking into their FECs, but if a candidate isn't taking corporate money, they usually are pretty proud to advertise.
It's kind of a tag, corporate free, right? Something like that.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Anybody you want to mention, Renaldo, while we're in the mentioning
I would refrain
phase?
from mentioning people and actually refer to that call you asked about young people and how they can sign up if they're not voting yet. I could say sign up with Democracy Spring and other organizations that have boots on the ground, because I'm sure there's a pro-democracy reform that you can help to advance in your city or state. It's a whole list of things that counter those 7 deadly sins or redeem the nation of those 7 deadly sins that I outlined. So that could be automatic voter registration, which is over 12 states now, New Jersey being the last one. So these pro-democracy reforms are winning. It could be vote by mail, which is now more popular because of how it boosts voter turnout and more secure than the systems that we have right now. It could be ranked choice voting, which just advanced in Maine. Independent redistricting, independent redistricting commissions, that's a mouthful there, to rein in on gerrymandering, or the National Popular Vote Compact for going against the Electoral College. So many different things. So go to democracyspring.org, and I'm happy to, our organizers are everywhere across this nation. We're happy to help assist them into being a part of that change we wish to see.
And what about all the elders out there who are excited to hear all of this and wondering, well, does that mean I should just step back and let them take over?
I personally would say absolutely not. I think none of us up here are arrogant enough to think that we don't need mentorship and we don't need guidance. Folks have been fighting this fight for a very long time, and we absolutely look up to the folks who have been in the arena for longer than we have. But what we ask is, help us, mentor us, show us the way, and let us lead. We need a new generation to come in. And to go back to your question about some candidates, I would just mention Gina Ortiz-Jones down in Texas, endorsed by Emily's List. She's a veteran, first-generation Filipino-American. I would also mention Lauren Underwood in Illinois, first-time candidate, worked in the Obama administration. And then, of course, Beto O'Rourke, trying to take Ted Cruz's seat. At Millennial Politics, we're focused on federal-level races because we think the best way to put a check on the Trump administration is to flip either the House and the Senate, or the Senate, and install as many Democratic governors as possible. So check out those candidates, take a look at their races, and of course, if you know a millennial, make sure that they are registered to vote and explain to them how they can get involved.
And we haven't talked much about third-party campaigns, but presumably candidates running on the Green Party or one of the other third-party platforms would also be represented at Millennial Politics if they're in that age group?
So right now we do not feature third-party candidates. We're really focused on building up the Democratic Party. We believe that, like it or not, we are operating in a two-party system, and to bring the change that we need to work both inside the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party, because our biggest concern is having a Trump administration go unchecked.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Yes, what he just said is a fact, unfortunately, and that's why one of the things I list is as a countermeasure to those 7 deadly sins is ranked choice voting. When you have a ranked choice voting system, then third, you won't have to worry about a spoiled candidate or a spoiler. Ranked choice candidates or ranked choice voting actually allows for third parties without you worrying about that duopoly.
Yeah, and if I could kind of pop in here as well, I do think that while we are, perhaps some ways away from third parties on a federal level, perhaps sooner than we even think we may be, I do think that building power on local city council levels is a really viable way for third parties. Some states are much easier, said than done. Tish James actually won her city council seat as a working families candidate. That's right. And that requires, I think, as young people, for us to think a little bit outside the box. I was really proud. I'm running as a Democrat. I'm proud to run as a Democrat in this cycle. But last year I was also proud to endorse Jabari Brisport, who ran here on New York City Council, and he was a Green Party candidate and a Socialist Party candidate as well. But he was fighting back kind of against the scourge of luxury real estate overdevelopment in New York City that is really pinching working families. And I think there are some levels where we need to realize that our issues are not left and right, or they're not partisan, but they are up and down. And when someone on another ballot line, whether it's working families, Green Party, Socialists, so on, is standing for the right things, we need to be willing to endorse and collaborate on those issues. And kind of also speaking to the point on elders as well, the average age of a House Democrat is at its highest point in American history. Average age is 65 years old as a House Democrat. You have to be 25 years old to run for Congress. And so, I think where we benefit from is the diversity of age represented in our government, because when it's just older Americans that are represented, how are we going to really prepare for things like automation in our economy, tuition-free public college, a student loan crisis, and forward-thinking kind of issues as well?
Final question. Once the election is over and all of your candidates have won and it's a brand new day, how do you keep them accountable? Renaldo?
Well, the same thing we did in April 2016 when we organized the largest act of American civil disobedience this century. March from Philadelphia to D.C. We need to do the same thing, have folks there on the steps of the Capitol, sitting in if necessary, pretty much holding these politicians accountable. You say a better deal for democracy is what you're promising? All right. Do it.
Okay. Yeah, so state politics have lived in obscurity for so long. State House reporters are declining by 35%. We are reporting on what's going on in these state houses, not just what happens from Labor Day to Election Day, but what happens from Election Day to Labor Day after that, with Medicaid expansion passing or with automatic voter registration passing in Washington, to exciting things, but also all of the assaults on small d democracy, when governors cancel special elections, when legislatures try to throw out judges who don't rule in their favor. This is all happening at the state level, and we're trying to be a home for that.
Final word from you, Nathan.
Well, I think getting involved in campaigns early is a really good way to build rapport with those politicians that are ultimately elected. When you are there throughout the campaign helping them get elected, when it comes time for your issue and you know that they are going to take a stand one way or another, you have their ear and you have that respect that I was there for you in the beginning and now this issue is important to me. Don't do me wrong, I am your constituent.
I've knocked doors for you, now I can knock on your door.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time, so please join me in thanking our guests on this joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I want to thank Catherine Vaughn for your efforts to flip the script and turn red states blue, Renaldo Pearson for helping to build a 50-state nonviolent army of volunteer leaders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for having the courage to stand, to run as part of a new generation, and Nathan Rubin for consistently highlighting the need to address the concerns of young voters who are now, in case you didn't get this, the single largest voting bloc in America. From the Manhattan Neighborhood Network studios at El Barrio Firehouse in East Harlem, New York, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching this edition of our series, Elections 2018, The Progressive Path Forward.